They told her the wooden leg made her unsuitable. The State Department rejection letter was polite but firm. A physical disability of this nature simply precluded service in the Foreign Service. Too much standing required, too much walking, too much risk of complications and difficult postings. The hunting accident in Turkey that had taken her left leg below the knee in 1933 had apparently ended her diplomatic ambitions before they'd truly begun. Virginia Hall was 27 years old, spoke fluent French, German, and Italian, held degrees from prestigious universities, and had spent years preparing for exactly this career. None of it mattered. The prosthetic limb she called Cuthbert, she'd named it with dark humor, was all anyone could see. What the State Department bureaucrats couldn't imagine, what they couldn't conceive in their comfortable Washington offices, was that this disability would become one of the most effective operational assets in the history of modern espionage. That wooden leg, the one that supposedly made her unsuitable for diplomatic work, would carry her over the Pyrenees Mountains in winter while the Gestapo hunted her. It would help her blend in as an aging peasant woman when she returned to occupied France. It would become so notorious that Nazi intelligence files would obsess over the limping lady with an intensity usually reserved for heads of state, and it would still be attached to her leg when she stood in the Oval Office receiving the Distinguished Service Cross, the only civilian woman in American history to earn that honor, while knowing in her bitter, brilliant mind that her own country's intelligence service would never promote her beyond mid-level positions because she was female. This is the story of Virginia Hall, and it's not a story about overcoming disability. It's a story about weaponizing every single thing the world used to dismiss you. It's about turning rejection into motivation, disadvantage into camouflage, and exclusion into expertise. By the time we're done, you'll understand why Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, dedicated enormous resources to hunting one American woman. You'll know why the Gestapo put a price on her head higher than almost any other Allied agent. And you'll feel the rage she must have felt when, after defeating the Nazis, her reward was a desk job and a glass ceiling. Because Virginia Hall didn't just become a spy despite having one leg. She became the most dangerous Allied operative in France precisely because everyone, enemy and ally alike, underestimated what a woman with a wooden leg could do. The rejection from the State Department in 1939 could have been the end of the story. Most people would have returned to Baltimore, to the comfortable life of Maryland society, to a safe administrative job that didn't require extensive fieldwork. Virginia Hall was not most people. The daughter of a wealthy banking family, she'd grown up with every advantage except the one she wanted most: to be taken seriously in a man's world of international diplomacy and intelligence. She'd studied in Paris, Vienna, and Strasbourg. She'd worked as a consular clerk in Warsaw, Izmir, and Venice, watching from the sidelines as male colleagues with half her language skills and a tenth of her political instincts received the postings she craved. Then came the hunting accident in Turkey. A shotgun discharged accidentally. Gangrene set in. The leg came off below the knee. She was 27, and suddenly, instead of being merely female, which was obstacle enough, she was also crippled, to use the language of the time. The double dismissal was complete. But something happened during those months of recovery that the bureaucrats who rejected her couldn't measure on a fitness examination. Virginia Hall developed an absolute refusal to accept limitations defined by other people. She learned to walk with Cuthbert, to climb stairs, to dance even. More importantly, she learned that pity and underestimation could be tools. People who saw the limp stopped seeing the mind. They stopped seeing the threat. When war broke out in Europe in 1939, Hall was in Paris, working for the French ambulance service. She could have evacuated, she should have evacuated. American citizens were being urged to leave as German forces swept through Poland and prepared for their assault on France. Instead, she stayed, driving ambulances through combat zones, watching the French military collapse, seeing firsthand how espionage and intelligence failures had left the Allies blind and unprepared. When France fell in June 1940, she made her way to London with a singular purpose. She was going to fight back, and if the Americans wouldn't let her do it officially, she'd find someone who would. That someone turned out to be the British. The Special Operations Executive Zoe was Churchill's attempt to set Europe ablaze through sabotage, subversion, and support for resistance movements. They needed agents fluent in French who could pass as locals, who had the intelligence to organize networks, and who had the courage to operate in occupied territory knowing that capture meant torture and execution. Virginia Hall spoke French like a native. She knew the country intimately, and she had one additional qualification that the SO recruiters recognized. She was so seemingly unremarkable, so apparently limited by her disability, that German security forces might overlook her. In August 1941, Virginia Hall became one of the first women sent into occupied France by British intelligence. She traveled undercover as a journalist for the New York Post. Her press credentials provided legitimate reason to ask questions, move between cities, and meet with various people. Her base was Vichy, France, the unoccupied zone technically governed by the puppet French government but heavily monitored by German intelligence. Her mission was to establish networks, identify resistance groups, arrange supply drops, coordinate sabotage operations, and transmit intelligence back to London. She was 35 years old, with a wooden leg, in a country where one wrong word could mean death. The early months were about building trust, which in the espionage trade is like building a house on sand during an earthquake. Resistance groups in France were fragmented, suspicious, and infiltrated by Vichy police informants and Opver agents. Virginia had to identify which groups were genuine, which leaders were competent rather than merely brave, and which operations had any chance of success. She had to do this while maintaining her journalistic cover, managing her communications with London through coded messages and radio operators who were themselves hunted constantly, and staying one step ahead of French police and German counterintelligence. Her wooden leg, the disability that had ended her State Department dreams, became her greatest asset. A well-dressed American woman with a noticeable limp asking questions. She seemed harmless, sympathetic even. Certainly not a professional intelligence operative. German security officials and Vichy police saw Cuthbert first and stopped analyzing what Virginia's questions actually meant. She used this blindness ruthlessly. Within 6 months, she'd organized one of the most effective networks in occupied France. She arranged parachute drops of weapons and explosives. She identified safe houses and escape routes. She coordinated sabotage of railroad lines and German facilities. She provided intelligence on German troop movements and Vichy police operations. And she became the key link in the underground railroad that moved down to Allied airmen from crash sites to Spain, from Spain to Gibraltar, from Gibraltar back to England to fly again. The Gestapo began to notice her in early 1942, though they didn't yet know her real name. Their files referred to the limping lady or the woman with the limp. That visible disability was how they tracked her, how they described her in their intelligence reports. They knew she was connected to resistance activities. They knew she coordinated with London. They suspected she was either British or American intelligence. But they couldn't catch her, and their frustration grew into obsession. Klaus Barbie, who had become known as the Butcher of Lyon for his torture and execution of thousands of resistance fighters, personally directed operations to identify and capture her. Gestapo headquarters in Paris elevated her to their most wanted list. The irony was savage. The leg that made her unsuitable for normal espionage work made her uniquely identifiable to the enemy, but also uniquely underestimated. They were looking for a disabled woman, not a professional intelligence operative running one of the most effective networks in France. Then came the betrayal. In November 1942, the Germans invaded Vichy France, eliminating the pretense of unoccupied territory. The net was closing. One of Virginia's network contacts, a French priest named Father L.H., had been turned by the Obver German military intelligence. He knew her real name. He knew her safe houses. He knew her contacts. The Gestapo was coming. Virginia Hall had perhaps 36 hours warning. She could have tried to hide in place, go to ground in one of her safe houses, wait for the Germans to move on. But she knew counterintelligence well enough to understand they weren't moving on. They were coming specifically for her. Her only chance was to reach Spain, neutral territory, from which she could make her way to London. The problem was the Pyrenees. It was November. Winter storms were beginning. The mountain passes between France and Spain were treacherous even for experienced mountaineers with 2 functioning legs. The route she needed to take involved 12 hours of climbing through snow and ice at high altitude, crossing at night to avoid German patrols, navigating without lights, carrying minimal supplies. Guides regularly refused to take people during winter months. Too many died from exposure, fell from cliffs in the dark, or were caught by German border guards who had learned all the crossing points. Virginia Hall had a wooden leg held on with leather straps. The prosthetic had no ankle flexibility, no ability to sense terrain or adjust to unstable footing. In snow and ice, it became essentially a wooden peg. Every step was deliberate, weight-bearing, exhausting. She did it anyway. On a freezing November night, Virginia and a small group of refugees began the crossing. She dewrapped extra padding around the stump of her leg because she knew the pressure and cold would be excruciating. She'd adjusted Cuthbert's straps as tight as she could bear because any slip, any moment of looseness, would mean the prosthetic coming off at the worst possible moment. And then she climbed. The guide later said he'd never seen anything like it. While others struggled and complained, this American woman with one leg just kept moving. When they stopped to rest, she'd massage the stump to restore circulation. When ice made the path treacherous, she'd use her arms to pull herself up inclines, the wooden legs scraping and jamming into crevices. At one point, they crossed a ridge where one wrong step meant a 1,000-foot fall. Virginia crossed it in darkness, feeling the path with Cuthbert, trusting the wooden leg to hold her weight even as she could unfeel what it was resting on. 12 hours. Through snow, over mountains, on a wooden leg, with the Gestapo hunting her behind and uncertain refuge ahead. She made it to Spain, she made it to the British consulate, and she sent a message back to London that has become legendary in intelligence history. Her radio operator's coded transmission read, "Cuthbert is being tiresome, but I can cope, London." Not understanding the reference to her prosthetic leg sent back, "If Cuthbert is tiresome, have him eliminated." Virginia's response has not survived in the files, but one imagines it was not fit for official records. She spent early 1943 in London, recovering, debriefing, and seething with the need to get back into the fight. The Gestapo had rolled up much of her network. Father Alesh's betrayal had resulted in dozens of arrests, tortures, executions. The people she'd worked with, the resistance fighters she'd trained and supplied, were being hunted because they'd trusted her, not because she detailed in security she'd been meticulous, but because one collaborator with access had sold them all out. The guilt and rage drove her to volunteer for immediate redeployment. The British hesitated. Her face was too well known now. The Gestapo had photographs, descriptions, witness statements. They knew about the wooden leg. Every German intelligence service and Vichy police unit in France had been briefed. Watch for an American woman with a pronounced limp. Her most distinctive feature had become her greatest liability. So Virginia Hall did something that still astonishes intelligence historians. She transformed her appearance so completely that she returned to occupied France and operated for another year without the Gestapo recognizing her. She dyed her hair gray. She learned to walk differently, not hiding the limp, but changing it, redistributing her weight in ways that altered her gait. She dressed as an elderly peasant woman, the kind of person so common in rural France that German soldiers looked through her rather than at her. She wore thick, shapeless clothing that obscured her actual build. She learned to move like an old woman, slow and careful, bent slightly forward. And in September 1943, now working for the American Oster Office of Strategic Services, precursor to the CIA, she parachuted back into France. Except she didn't parachute. The OSS doctors ruled her medically unfit for parachute operations because of Cuthbert, so she went by boat, landing on a beach in Brittany, wading ashore with her wooden leg wrapped in waterproof canvas, at age 37, ready to do it all again. This second mission was even more dangerous than the first. It was 1943 and 1944 now. The Germans knew invasion was coming, they just didn't know where or when. Security was tighter. Reprisals against resistance activities were more savage. The Gestapo had become expert at infiltrating networks and rolling them up systematically. And Virginia Hall was operating in central France, organizing the Mercurial resistance fighters to prepare for D-Day. She lived in a farmhouse in the Haute-Loire region, posing as an elderly peasant woman named Marcelle Montaigne. She milked cows, she made cheese, she tended gardens, and she coordinated arms drops, trained guerrilla fighters, identified targets for sabotage, and transmitted intelligence on German troop dispositions. German soldiers billeted in the area saw her as she shuffled through her daily routines. They never looked twice. An old French peasant woman with a limp, not worth noticing. The OSS files from this period reveal the scope of what she accomplished. Her networks would eventually number over 1,500 resistance fighters. She coordinated dozens of sabotage operations that destroyed bridges, cut railway lines, ambushed German convoys, and transmitted intelligence that shaped Allied tactical planning. When D-Day came in June 1944, the German response was hampered by cut communications, destroyed infrastructure, and harassment from resistance groups that Virginia Hall had organized and supplied. The Gestapo never identified her. Klaus Barbie, still obsessed with the limping lady, never realized she'd returned. The disabled American woman he'd spent years hunting was operating in his region, coordinating the resistance that was tearing apart his security operations, and he didn't recognize her because she de-transformed her most identifiable feature, that limp, from a liability into a costume piece in her cover. After the liberation of France, Virginia Hall continued operations, moving into Austria and Germany itself as the Allies pushed toward Berlin. She coordinated intelligence gathering on German defensive positions. She helped process Nazi intelligence officers who wanted to defect. She identified war criminals for eventual prosecution. She was in Germany when the war ended, still operating, still gathering intelligence, still proving that she was more capable than any of the men who de-rejected her State Department application 6 years earlier. In September 1945, Virginia Hall was summoned to the Oval Office. President Truman awarded her the Distinguished Service Cross, the only civilian woman to receive the decoration. The citation praised her extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against the enemy. She'd requested a private ceremony, no press, no publicity. The OSS agreed. Partly for her safety, she'd planned to continue in intelligence work, partly because they understood her nature. She didn't want to be celebrated. She wanted to be useful. Then came the peace, and with it, the betrayal that would mark the rest of her life. The OSS dissolved in 1945. Its functions were scattered across various agencies until the CIA was formally established in 1947. Virginia Hall joined immediately. She was one of the first civilians recruited into the new Central Intelligence Agency. She had unparalleled field experience, spoke 6 languages, understood European politics and intelligence services better than almost any American alive, and had proven herself under the most extreme operational conditions imaginable. The CIA put her behind a desk and never promoted her beyond mid-level officer positions. The official explanations were bureaucratic. Her age: she was 41 in 1947. Her disability: Cuthbert was back to being a problem now that the shooting had stopped. Her lack of formal military rank: irrelevant for the OSS during wartime, apparently essential for peacetime advancement. But Virginia Hall knew, and every woman in the intelligence community knew, what the real reason was. She was female. The men who'd been happy to send her into occupied France when they needed someone disposable, someone who could be denied if captured, suddenly found her unsuitable for leadership when the wars ended and the promotions began. She spent the next decade analyzing intelligence from a desk in Washington. Her knowledge of European resistance movements, her understanding of Soviet intelligence operations in Western Europe, her expertise in covert action, all of it was available, and almost none of it was utilized. Male colleagues with fraction of her experience moved up the ladder. Men she'd trained in field techniques became station chiefs while she wrote reports that went unread. The agency that owed its early European operations partly to the networks she'd debuilt treated her as a clerk with an interesting wartime resume. The files from her CIA career show a woman who tried, repeatedly, to get back into operational work. She volunteered for postings. She proposed operations. She offered to train new field officers. The answer was always some version of no, too old, too disabled, too controversial, too risky. The unspoken reason was simply too female. 1966. Virginia Hall retired from the CIA at mandatory retirement age. She was 60. She'd received the Distinguished Service Cross, Francis Croix de Guerre, and Britain's Member of the Order of the British Empire. She'd organized resistance networks that helped liberate France. She'd outsmarted the Gestapo for years. She'd climbed over mountains on a wooden leg while the Nazis' most feared interrogator hunted her. And she retired angry. Friends from the period describe a woman who felt betrayed by the country she'd served. She'd accepted the risks, torture, execution, betrayal. She'd accepted the conditions behind enemy lines, cut off from support, operating alone. What she couldn't accept, what she never reconciled with, was the peacetime discrimination that deemed her heroism in wartime irrelevant when it came to peacetime promotions. She'd been good enough to risk her life when they needed someone deniable. She wasn't good enough to lead when the shooting stopped and the careers began. She moved to a farm in Maryland with her partner Paul Goylet, an OSS colleague she'd married late in life. They raised goats. She avoided publicity, rarely spoke about her wartime service, and rejected most requests for interviews. When the few journalists who discovered her story came calling, she was polite but firm. She wasn't interested in being celebrated. What would be the point? The celebration came too late, from the same institutions that had sidelined her. The intelligence community essentially forgot her. CIA training programs didn't mention her operations. Histories of the OSS and so focused on male agents. The photographs of her receiving the Distinguished Service Cross weren't displayed in CIA headquarters. Her techniques weren't studied in counterintelligence courses. She'd been too effective to ignore during the war and too female to remember after it. Virginia Hall died in 1982 at age 76. The obituaries were brief. Most newspapers ran just a few paragraphs noting her wartime service. The Washington Post mentioned the Distinguished Service Cross and the wooden leg. The New York Times gave her 6 sentences. The CIA's internal newsletter ran a notice that identified her primarily as the wife of Paul Goylet, the woman Klaus Barbie had called the most dangerous of all. Allied spies received less attention in death than minor politicians and local business leaders. The operative who'd organized 1,500 resistance fighters and coordinated operations across occupied France was remembered, if at all, as an interesting footnote. The only civilian woman to receive the Distinguished Service Cross died in obscurity, while male agents with 10th of her accomplishments became consultants, authors, and celebrated intelligence veterans. It took decades for her story to re-emerge. Historians researching SOE and OSS operations in France kept finding references to someone who seemed to be at the center of everything, coordinating networks, arranging drops, transmitting crucial intelligence. The code names varied: Germaine, Marie, Diane, Nicholas, but the descriptions pointed to the same person: American, female, disabled, and impossibly effective. When researchers finally connected the fragments, they realized they'd uncovered one of the most successful intelligence operatives of World War II, someone who'd been deliberately buried by institutional sexism and Cold War secrecy protocols. The CIA formally acknowledged her contributions in 2016, more than 3 decades after her death. They named a dining facility after her at their training center, a gesture that would have infuriated her, given that she'd spent her career fighting for operational recognition, not cafeteria designations. In 2019, a statue was proposed for the CIA headquarters lobby. In 2020, the OSS Society began actively promoting her story as an example of diverse excellence in intelligence. But here's what matters for understanding intelligence work, and for understanding how institutional discrimination operates. Virginia Hall succeeded precisely because everyone underestimated her. The State Department rejected her because they saw disability. The Gestapo hunted her but couldn't conceive that a woman with a wooden leg could be their most effective enemy. The CIA promoted men past her because they saw gender before competence. And every single one of them was wrong. Her wooden leg wasn't a limitation, it was operational camouflage. Her gender wasn't a weakness, it made her less threatening, more dismissible, more able to move through occupied territory without triggering the same scrutiny male agents faced. Her age, when she returned to France in her late 30s, made her elderly peasant woman disguise more convincing. Every single thing the bureaucrats used to exclude her became a tactical advantage once someone actually sent her into the field. The disability that ended her diplomatic career created the intelligence operative who terrified Nazi Germany. This is why her story matters beyond the historical record of World War II operations. Virginia Hall proved that the characteristics institutions use to exclude people with disability, gender, age, unconventional backgrounds can be precisely what makes someone extraordinary at the work those institutions claim to do. The same agencies that rejected her because she did unfit their narrow definition of suitable later relied on her to accomplish what their suitable candidates could not. She organized more resistance fighters than most male OS officers. She survived longer in occupied territory than the average agent life expectancy. She transmitted more actionable intelligence than many entire networks. She coordinated sabotage operations that directly contributed to D-Day success. And she did all of this while walking on a wooden leg that her own government had declared made her unfit for fieldwork. The Gestapo understood her danger better than her own intelligence service. Klaus Barbie devoted enormous resources to hunting the limping lady because he recognized what the CIA later refused to acknowledge. She was operationally brilliant. Her networks were secure, her tradecraft was exceptional, her psychological understanding of both resistance fighters and enemy counterintelligence was sophisticated. Beyond her training, she succeeded not despite being a disabled woman, but because being a disabled woman in the 1940s meant everyone and enemy underestimated what she could do. Think about the operational timeline. In 1941, she is rejected by the State Department because a wooden leg makes her unsuitable for diplomatic work that involves standing at receptions and walking up embassy stairs. By 1942, she's coordinating covert networks across occupied France. By 1943, she's so dangerous that the Gestapo elevates her to their most wanted list. By 1944, she's organizing over 1,000 resistance fighters and coordinating sabotage operations. By 1945, she's receiving the Distinguished Service Cross from the President. By 1966, she's forcibly retired from a desk job she was overqualified for, denied the promotions and operational assignments her record merited. The arc is infuriating precisely because it's so revealing. America needed her when the work was dangerous and deniable. America celebrated her when victory required acknowledging heroism. America sidelined her when peace meant she'd compete with men for advancement. And America forgot her when she died because remembering would require acknowledging how badly the intelligence community had failed one of its most capable officers. Her wooden leg should be in the Smithsonian, preserved as the prosthetic limb that climbed the Pyrenees, walked through occupied France, and carried one of America's greatest intelligence officers through operations that changed history. Instead, it's presumably gone, discarded or lost, as forgotten as the woman who wore it. Her technique should be studied in every intelligence training program: how she built networks, how she maintained security, how she used her supposed limitations as operational advantages. Instead, her methods went largely undocumented because the CIA was more interested in forgetting an inconvenient woman than learning from an exceptional operative. Her story should be taught alongside those of William Donovan, Alan Dulles, and other OS legends. Instead, she remained obscure until recent historians and advocates forced the intelligence community to acknowledge what they tried to bury: that their most effective French operative was a woman they discriminated against before, during, and after her service. The Gestapo files on the limping lady run to hundreds of pages: intelligence assessments, witness reports, interrogation transcripts of captured agents who'd worked with her, operational orders trying to predict her movements. The Nazi security apparatus understood her value better than American intelligence did. They dedicated resources to hunting her that they reserved for the most dangerous enemies. They knew she was coordinating major resistance operations. They recognized her tradecraft excellence. They feared her effectiveness. Meanwhile, her own agency was planning to put her behind a desk as soon as the war ended. Virginia Hall's bitterness in retirement was entirely justified. She'd proven herself in ways that most intelligence officers never would. She'd survived in occupied territory longer than most agents lasted. She debuilt networks that actually worked, no small achievement in an era when infiltration and betrayal were constant threats. She'd demonstrated courage under conditions that broke trained soldiers, and her reward was bureaucratic marginalization, blocked promotions, and institutional amnesia. When people discuss breaking glass ceilings, Virginia Hall's story should be the example. She didn't just crack the ceiling, she climbed over mountains, operated in enemy territory, and accomplished missions that male colleagues couldn't or wouldn't attempt. And she still couldn't get promoted in peacetime. When people discuss disability and capability, Virginia Hall's wooden leg should end the conversation. She didn't overcome disability to become a spy. She weaponized her disability to become a more effective spy than the able-bodied agents who'd told her she was unsuitable. Cuthbert, the wooden leg that ended her State Department dreams, became the prosthetic limb that carried her through operations that earned America's highest military decoration for civilians. When people discuss forgotten heroes, Virginia Hall should be the first name mentioned. Not because her story is the most dramatic, though climbing the Pyrenees on a wooden leg while the Gestapo hunts you is pretty dramatic, but because her institutional erasure is so complete and so revealing. The same agencies that celebrated male operatives with similar or lesser accomplishments actively suppressed her story and blocked her advancement. She died angry, and she had every right to be angry. She'd given her 20s to preparing for diplomatic service. She'd given her leg to a hunting accident that ended those dreams. She'd given her 30s and 40s to intelligence work that risked her life daily. She'd given her 50s to an agency that wouldn't promote her past middle management. And she'd given her retirement years to raising goats on a Maryland farm while the CIA trained new officers, without mentioning that one of their most effective operatives had been a disabled woman they discriminated against for decades. The statue they're considering for CIA headquarters will show her in heroic pose, probably with Cuthbert visible to emphasize the disability overcome narrative. But the real Virginia Hall, the one who died in 1982, would probably prefer a different memorial, an intelligence community that actually learned from her story, that recognized excellence regardless of gender, disability, or unconventional backgrounds, that studied her techniques instead of forgetting her operations, that promoted on capability rather than conformity to narrow definitions of suitable. She proved that disability could be advantage, that gender could be cover, that age could be disguise, that everything used to exclude her could become the reason she succeeded. The institutions she served never internalized these lessons. They gave her a medal, put her behind a desk, and forgot her as soon as they decently could. The Gestapo was better at recognizing her capabilities than the CIA was. Think about that. The Nazi security apparatus, brutal, efficient, and deeply prejudiced, understood Virginia Hall's operational excellence better than American intelligence did. Klaus Barbie hunted her because he recognized the damage she was doing to German control of France. CIA leadership sidelined her because they couldn't see past their own prejudices about women's capabilities. The enemy respected her more than her own side did. Virginia Hall walked into occupied France twice, operated for years under the noses of the Gestapo, coordinated major resistance networks, transmitted vital intelligence, survived betrayal, climbed mountains to escape, returned disguised to do it again, received the Distinguished Service Cross, and still couldn't get the CIA to take her seriously in peacetime. That's not just her story. That's the story of how institutions waste their best people because those people don't fit the template. It's the story of how discrimination operates, celebrating diversity when it's safe, suppressing it when it's competitive. It's the story of how courage and capability matter less than conformity when the shooting stops and the promotions begin. The woman who terrified the Gestapo couldn't get promoted past GS-13 in the CIA. The operative who'd organized 1,500 resistance fighters couldn't get a field assignment in peacetime. The agent who declimbed the Pyrenees on a wooden leg while Nazis hunted her couldn't overcome the barrier of being female in a male-dominated agency. She deserved better. She deserved operational commands, station chief positions, senior leadership roles. She deserved to train the next generation of officers, to design operations based on her experience, to shape intelligence doctrine with her hard-won expertise. Instead, she got a desk, a forced retirement, and decades of institutional amnesia. The only civilian woman to receive the Distinguished Service Cross died unknown. That's not a failure of Virginia Hall. That's a failure of the country she served and the agencies she made more effective. She did her part. They failed to do theirs, and the loss wasn't hers alone. It was the loss of every operation she could have led, every officer she could have trained, every technique she could have taught, every insight she could have contributed if the CIA had valued capability over conformity. Her wooden leg is a symbol now, in the few histories that remember her, but it shouldn't be a symbol of disability overcome. It should be a symbol of institutions failing to recognize excellence when it doesn't match their prejudices. Cuthbert carried Virginia Hall through occupied France, over the Pyrenees, through operations that helped liberate Europe. American intelligence carried her to a desk job in historical obscurity. She deserved recognition. She got marginalization. She deserved command. She got typewriters and filing cabinets. She deserved to shape Cold War intelligence operations with her operational expertise. She got forced retirement at 60, and when she died, she got 6 sentences in the New York Times, the limping lady. The woman the Gestapo feared most, the operative who proved that a wooden leg could climb mountains and outsmart Nazi counterintelligence, died angry and forgotten. Not because she failed, because her own country's intelligence service failed her, repeatedly, for decades, in ways that were both deliberate and institutionally systemic. Remember her name. Remember that disability didn't stop her, institutional discrimination did. Remember that the Gestapo respected her more than the CIA promoted her. Remember that she climbed mountains they said she couldn't walk up, coordinated operations they said she was unsuitable for, and survived dangers they said she couldn't face. Virginia Hall, American, disabled, female, dismissed, underestimated, decorated with the Distinguished Service Cross, sidelined by her own intelligence service, dead at 76 in obscurity while lesser operatives became legends. She was too disabled for the State Department, too dangerous for the Gestapo, and too female for the CIA. History is finally starting to remember her. It took 40 years after her death, but the recognition is coming. The question is, what took so long, and what are we still missing because we're re-looking for heroes who fit templates instead of recognizing excellence in whatever form it takes? Virginia Hall proved that the person everyone dismisses might be exactly the person who saves you. The disability that disqualifies, the gender that excludes, the age that limits, all of them can be precisely what makes someone extraordinary at the work institutions claim matters most. She walked on a wooden leg through occupied France and changed history. Her own country couldn't see past that wooden leg to recognize one of its greatest intelligence officers. Their failure, not hers. Remember that. Their failure